The 2025 Major League Baseball trade deadline is approaching. A, how does it work? B, what do we expect to see? And C, how are teams going to look going into the playoff push or just the second half of the season? Now, starting off with when the MLB trade deadline is, it is July 31st at 6 p.m. Eastern. That is a hard deadline, meaning that no trades for MLB teams can occur after that deadline. It's like that in every sports. There's a trade deadline, but normally Major League Baseball is the most, you could say, interesting trade deadline among the professional sports, simply because a lot of teams do make a lot of trades to try to increase their chances at a playoff spot or increase their chances of success towards the second half of the season. Now, starting with how trade deadline works, simply put, players are traded for other players. It's different than other leagues where you have players traded for draft picks. In Major League Baseball, you cannot trade draft picks. So it is players for prospects, players already, veteran players usually, or players that are playing very well, traded for players that have not proven it yet but are going to. They're prospects, they're prospectively positive in their play, and that is usually how it works. Now, you start with a couple different levels of teams, starting with those at the top, who are primed for a playoff spot and trying to make a deep playoff run. Then you have the middle of the pack who are on the verge of a playoff spot, who might buy or might sell, depending on how their team goes into the trade deadline, the weeks leading up to it, and how they play. Then there's the bottom of the barrel, the teams who have not had success in the season or for a number of seasons in a row. No, they are not fighting for a playoff spot, and they're going to sell off at the trade deadline wholeheartedly. Now, starting with those top tier teams, typically they're going to buy one or two positions that are the weakest on their spot no matter what. Now, they might have to deal some top prospects, but again, they've had such a successful season, they know that it is worth it for this season for them to augment their chances. Now, going to one of the teams that really is going to have a solid playoff spot but needs some help, that's the Los Angeles Dodgers, and they need some starting pitching strength because they have lost several of their starters for the season. So the Dodgers are probably going to go out and look for a starting pitcher on a team that is in the bottom of the barrel who are going to sell off, who's probably on an expiring contract. Those players are typically called rentals because you're only going to have that player for the second half of the season, and then they're going to be a free agent. Now, sometimes they re-sign with the team that bought them, but not always. So you see that, and a lot of those teams, they're going to buy good players. You just don't know which team's going to buy it. And that kind of what drives the prices, because certain teams, some potentially in the middle of the pack, don't want those top teams to get those specific players. So they might be willing to pay more to the lower teams in terms of prospects to keep the top team from getting that player. That is why it is a total bidding war between teams, and whoever normally gets that prospect, or rather good player, has to pay with a lot of prospects. And sometimes, depending on that, it can be very interesting how that plays out in years in the future, simply because some teams traded some prospects that they didn't think were going to be as good and turn out to be really good players. One of which was a swap the Chicago White Sox and the San Diego Padres made a couple years ago, where the San Diego Padres received a prospect named Fernando Tatis Jr. in exchange for a veteran starting pitcher who is pretty middle of the pack, I'd say, in James Shields. We obviously know how that has ended up. Fernando Tatis Jr., one of the best players in baseball. James Shields retired a long time ago, and the Chicago White Sox didn't really have success with that. So you can see some of these trades flop for the buying of the veterans and the selling of the prospects. But that's why normally always those worst teams end up doing better in the future, and the best teams don't always have that continuous success simply because they make a bad decision at the time that looked promising but ended up being very poor in return. Now we move to those middle of the pack teams, where I said can sometimes have a bidding war with the top teams, but really those teams are going to be the most aggressive at the trade deadline if they're buying. If they're selling, which means that they struggle to go into the deadline, then they're actually going to sell off a lot of their veteran or expiring contract players to some of those top teams or other teams that they don't think are going to succeed but want to buy, simply so that way the season is not a total loss, because then they'll have some good prospects going into next season that hopefully can contribute to the team. Now, for those teams, like I said, that are buying, they are going to be more aggressive at the trade deadline because of either ownership pressure or other pressures that may be, or simply put, they just feel as an organization really good to go all in. And some of those teams might make a series of moves where they deal a lot of their top prospects, kind of unloading their farm system to other teams in the league, simply for them to get a bunch of rentals and veterans to increase their chances of success this season, that they believe they can make a long-term postseason run. But normally when that happens, it's kind of a shock to fans and people in the media, simply because it's unexpected, because they've struggled in the season but really make a push. You've seen that with a lot of teams recently, not all of which who make a lot of trades at the trade deadline. I'd say the most famous recent team was the Atlanta Braves, who were under 500 going into the trade deadline, made a ton of moves in that 2021 season, and then won the World Series beating the Houston Astros. So it is very possible for a team in that middle of the pack to get hot at the end with a bunch of new talent they acquired at the trade deadline and come out victorious. But it is very rare to see that. And like I said, a lot of those teams are going to be aggressive at the trade deadline in that middle of the pack, because they know they cannot let those players go to other teams. If they feel like they are the team of destiny, they need to pay as much as they're willing as possible to get as many good players as they can to make that push to win the World Series. Now, you drop down to the bottom barrel of the teams that are consistently not in the playoff push, usually smaller market teams that they really just don't put the money into payroll to make a good team year in and year out. And those teams consistently sell at the trade deadline. They flip their top players for more prospects, and they try to be good the next year. Probably the best team who does this is the Tampa Bay Rays. What they do, because they're a small market team, is they get a bunch of prospects for players that they've already grown, but those players get so good that they're going to need a major contract, and usually they trade those players at a trade deadline for more prospects, so that way they can keep that engine going and continue to produce quality talent that is major league ready, and is usually going to help another team in the future, simply because they don't have the money to pay them a large contract. But the thing with the Tampa teams and some other teams of that fashion is that every now and then there's this one year where they turn really good. The year I'm referencing is 2020, where they made it all the way to the World Series and contended with the Los Angeles Dodgers in that World Series championship run. Now, again, it's not very often these teams are that good where they can make a push, but again, these smaller market teams often have these one-off years where they are really solid, and they do make a run at the playoffs. It's just few and far between, simply because that engine in that cycle only resets every so often. You could make that argument with the Baltimore Orioles, that a traditional small market team is really having a solid run right now because of all those consistent years getting top picks, because of their struggles in that long-term rebuild, and you're starting to see the success of that now. Now, yes, Baltimore has struggled this year, but the past couple of years they've been playoff teams, and they're looking to sustain this playoff run with their new ownership group that's willing to put in more money for the team. But it's just a really interesting topic and area of concern, where you see some of these small market teams bloom up and look really good for a little bit, but then they regress back down to that small market, really non-competitive team. Let me know what you think in the comments about the trade deadline, what you think your team's going to do, and who you want on your squad, or who you want to let go and get top prospects for in return. And as always, like and follow for more.